Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I'm Eric, and we'd like to build those unconventional commander decks. So, Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Today we're going to talk about the one and only shirtless legendary Rakdos Vampire Noble from the set that's all about werewolves. It's Florian, Voldaren Scion. This is a 3/3 with first strike that costs 1 black-red, and Florian has, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the total amount of life your opponent's lost this turn, exile one of those cards, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may play the exiled card this turn. Now that's a pretty full text box, so let's break this down. Basically, Florian gives you the opportunity to impulsive draw up to 1 additional card on each of your turns. And by impulsive, I just mean that you have to play that card this turn, or you'll lose it. It'll just stay exiled and you'll never see it again. Now, Florian rewards you for having your opponents lose life during your turn, and it doesn't matter how they lost that life. So you could build any sort of deck that causes your opponents to lose life, well again, as long as they're losing that life during your turn, and Florian will reward you. And that could be from combat, from group slug, or aristocrat, or whatever you feel like. And then Florian triggers during the beginning of your post-combat main phase to let you look at cards from the top of your library equal to the total life your opponents have lost this turn, and you can play one of those cards this turn. Now also note that if your opponents haven't lost any life, then you don't get to look at or play any cards, so let's try to make sure that never happens, okay? And finally, notice that you get to play the card you find. That means you can play lands this way, which is actually a great way of ensuring that you get your land drops every turn. Now, I was pretty dismissive of Florian at first. I mean, the most he'll do is give you 1 extra card per turn, and you have to play it this turn, and you still have to go through some extra work to get it. But in my playtesting, I've found that Florian is pure value. Selecting the best card from among a few, or a lot, from the top of your library is way, way better than drawing a card, and I didn't realize how good this was until I played with it. So Florian is sort of a value-based commander that gives you a lot of options for how to build around him. Now for this deck, I've chosen to build Group Slug. We're going to use consistent, repeatable effects that drain our opponents, or sometimes all players, including ourselves, to make sure that we can trigger Florian reliably every turn that he's on the battlefield. We're much more interested in getting a trigger every turn, even if we only get to look at a few cards, rather than playing with less reliable effects that can give us bigger rewards. Because again, if I ever have to pass my turn with Florian on the battlefield, and I didn't do any damage to my opponents that turn, well, I will be very sad. We'll also use a small package of lifegain effects to help keep us alive while we burn out the table. So this deck is meant to do small amounts of continuous damage to defeat our opponents by attrition, with a few heavy hitters in case we need them. So let's talk about the cards in the deck, starting with some of our creature-based sources of damage. So we want to be able to damage our opponents during our turn before our post-combat main phase for as little mana as possible, because that way, whatever we find with Florian's triggered ability, we'll actually have the mana to cast it, since we'll need to play it this turn. So we'll play lots of these little pinger creatures like Blister Split Gremlin, Spear Spewer, Lobber Crew, creatures that can tap to deal 1 damage to each opponent, or sometimes each player, just to make sure that we're getting that Florian trigger every turn, and it doesn't cost us much mana to do it. There's cards like Tectonic Giant, which can deal 3 damage to each of your opponents when it attacks. This is brutal. For no mana investment, other than casting the Giant of course, you'll get to deal 9 total damage in a 4-player game, and then of course look at the top 9 cards of your library with Florian. Speaking of Giants, we'll also play Quakebringer, which deals 2 damage to each opponent during your upkeep, and it prevents your opponents from gaining life, so that's nice. Thrashing Wumpus and Pestilence Demon let you repeatedly do 1 damage to each creature and player as many times as you want, for 1 black mana each time. Realistically, you'll probably only do this twice so that you don't kill Florian, but 6 total damage to your opponents for only 2 mana is a pretty good deal. And then of course there's Heartless Hidetsugu, which can tap to deal damage to each player equal to half their life total rounded down. This is obviously really awesome with Florian, and it practically turns look at the top few cards of your deck into basically tutor for whatever you want and play it this turn. These are all creatures that do damage to your opponents, and sometimes to yourself as well. And I wanted to mention all of these creatures first because they'll really let us take advantage of Lifelink. So we'll run a small package of lifelink enablers so that our pinging creatures will help keep us alive while we group slug the whole table. Especially Heartless Hidetsugu, that guy is hilarious with lifelink. Now for this we'll mostly use equipments and other reusable effects. A Basilisk Collar, Loxodon Warhammer, Poet's Quill, and the new Mask of Gristlebrand. These all let our pingers recover our life total while we burn down everyone else. Whip of Erebos just gives all of our creatures lifelink, and it lets us pay 2 black and tap it to reanimate one of our creatures from our graveyard. That creature will gain haste, but you'll also need to exile it at the end of the turn. So this will give us another single emergency use activation of one of our pingers that taps for damage. Again, really great with Heartless Hidetsugu. But lifelink is not the only way that will keep up our life total. Some of our other group slug effects will actually do that for us. Let's talk about those next. Now we really like drain effects that recover our life total, and again this helps us offset the damage that we'll take from symmetrical effects like Heartless Hidetsugu. And it also helps us mitigate combat damage that we end up taking since we don't have a lot of blockers in this deck. We mentioned a lot of creatures that tap to hit our opponents, and Florian makes us do this during our turn, so our creatures might all be tapped down during our opponent's turns, leaving us open to attack. Sanctum of Stonefangs, Ill-Gotten Inheritance, and Triskaidekaphobia are all enchantments that make your opponents lose 1 life or take 1 damage at the beginning of your upkeep, and you get to gain 1 life. Now, Sanctum of Stonefangs is a great bargain at only 2 mana for this effect. Ill-Gotten Inheritance costs 4, but you can also pay 5 and a black and sacrifice it to deal 4 damage to each opponent, and you gain 4 life. And the Triskaidekaphobia is a spicy one. This one also costs 4 mana, and it has at the beginning of your upkeep, choose 1. Each player with exactly 13 life loses the game, then each player gains 1 life. Or each player with exactly 13 life wins the game, then each player loses 1 life. Now, because of Florian, you'll almost always choose to have each player lose 1 life, but I like that Triskaidekaphobia also doubles as a possible win condition, even if it's pretty hard to pull off. And we'll also use Palace Siege. This is a 5 mana enchantment, and you get to pick either Khans or Dragons when it enters the battlefield. If you picked Khans, you get to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand at the beginning of each of your upkeeps. And if you picked Dragons, then at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. Now, Palace Siege is a bit expensive at 5 mana, and it won't do anything until your next turn, but I really like it in this deck because it's so flexible. We can really take advantage of both the Khans and the Dragons modes in this deck. And then finally we can play Zoff Consumption. This is an MDFC land, so it's a black mana producer on the backside, which is usually what you'll play. But you may just occasionally find value in the front side, which is a 6 mana sorcery that has each opponent lose 4 life and you gain 4 life. So again, really great with Florian. And now as long as we're gaining a bunch of life, we might end up with a surplus of it. Let's play a few cards that let us spend our life for value. Phyrexian Reclamation is really efficient graveyard recursion to help us get our creatures out of the graveyard. It's an enchantment that costs just a single black, and you can pay 1 and a black and 2 life to return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. Now, I also like Blood Tracker. This is a 4 mana 2/2 vampire with flying. You can pay black and 2 life to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when Blood Tracker leaves the battlefield, you draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. So this is another great way to turn our excess life into value, and I also like that Blood Tracker can make itself big and has flying, so we might be able to hit an opponent with it to help us dig deeper into our deck with Florian. Okay, so now we're playing our pinger creatures that hit our opponents, so we can give them lifelink to help support our life total, and we're also playing these draining effects that hit our opponents and give life back to us. But we've still got more ways to bring down our opponent's life totals to trigger Florian, and of course just, knock your opponents out of the game. Let's talk about those next. So we want to fill our deck with cards that damage our opponents during our turn to trigger Florian. We've mentioned a lot of those cards already, but we've got plenty more as well. Flame Rift is a single-use effect, but it's so efficient that it's hard not to include it. This is a 2 mana sorcery that simply deals 4 damage to each player, letting us dig 12 cards deep with Florian all by itself in a 4-player game. Loyal Subordinate is perfect for Florian. This is a 3 mana zombie with Lieutenant. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, each opponent loses 3 life. Then we'll use Direfleet Ravager, which is a sort of weaker but faster version of Heartless Hidetsugu. It's a 5-mana Orc Pirate Wizard with Menace and Death Touch, but more importantly, when it enters the battlefield, each player loses a third of their life, rounded up. We can even use lands to help trigger Florian. A Leech-Ridden Swamp lets you pay a black and tap it to have each opponent lose 1 life, but you can only activate this ability if you control 2 or more black permanents. Shivan Gorge lets you pay 2 and a red and tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent. This is a bit costly on mana to activate, but it's on a land, so it's easy to include in the deck. Now I also like Keen Duelist. This helps you draw cards and do damage at the same time. It's a 2-mana 2/2 creature with, at the beginning of your upkeep, you and target opponent each reveal the top card of your library, you each lose life equal to the mana value of the card revealed by the other player, and you each put the card you revealed into your hand. So yes, it does let an opponent draw a card too, but at least you get to pick that opponent. Now for removal, I like Cut to Ribbons. This is an Aftermath card. So first you cast Cut. This is a 2-mana sorcerer that deals 4 damage to target creature, which is fine. But when it's in your graveyard, you can cast the Aftermath side of the card, Ribbons. This costs X black, and it has each opponent lose X life. So again, a really great way to enable Florian with Ribbons, coupled with creature removal in Cut. And then finally we'll use Arterial Flow, which is a nice vampire payoff. It's a 3-mana sorcery that has each opponent discard 2 cards, and if you control a vampire, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. So you'll probably only ever cast this while Florian is in play. So that's most of the deck, but there are a few cards I still want to mention. These cards don't necessarily do damage to trigger Florian, but they're still really great support cards. So I want to mention a few more deck synergies, starting with some creatures. But first, we need to mention Prosper Tomebound. Now Prosper is a new and very popular Rakdos commander that gives you ramp and card advantage, which is awesome. You might even be asking, why should I play Florian when Prosper exists? And I thought the same thing too, until I realized how awesome Florian's triggered ability is. Again, the fact that Florian digs 3 or 6 or 10 or more cards deep into your library to find exactly what you need, this has performed way better for me than just drawing a card. That said, Prosper is still a very powerful card, and is a great include in a Florian deck. Since Prosper makes you a treasure when you play a card from exile, and anything you play with Florian's triggered ability is being played from exile, so Prosper will help ramp you by doing, what your commander already wants to do, so it's a great fit in this deck. Now we also need to talk about Torbran, Thane of Redfell. This guy doesn't do damage directly, but it amplifies our damage insanely. This is a 2/4 Dwarf Noble that costs 1 red, and it has, if a red source you control will deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. With all of our pinger creatures, which are mostly red, a Torbran will really bump up our damage output, and let us dig through more of our deck with Florian as a result. And it's really cool that Torbran only increases the damage we deal to our opponents or their permanents, so our symmetrical effects won't hit us harder with Torbran, only our opponents. And then there's Chandra's Incinerator. This thing is amazing. It's a 6/6 with trample that costs 5 and a red, but it costs X less to cast, where X is the amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. So it's pretty easy to reduce this cost to just a single red. And Chandra's Incinerator has, whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that opponent controls. So this will absolutely nuke your opponent's creatures for free just by using all of your group Slug effects. And note, of course, that Chandra's Incinerator will only trigger when you have an effect cause damage, not loss of life. So those are some of our really synergistic creatures. Now I want to mention a couple of ramp cards. First, there's Liquimetal Torque. Now, this is not specifically a Florian synergy, but it's decent ramp. It's a 2-mana artifact that taps for colorless. And you can also tap it so that target non-land permanent becomes an artifact in addition to its other types until end of turn. So this lets us turn things like enchantments, which we have a hard time removing in Rakdos, into artifacts, which we can kill much more readily. Again, not really a Florian synergy specifically, but a really cool card nonetheless. Now, I also want to mention Cursed Mirror. Again, this doesn't specifically synergize with Florian, but this card has performed well for me. It's a 3-mana artifact that taps for red, so it's a very, very mediocre mana rock. But when it enters the battlefield, you can have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except it has haste. So this is a really cool way to gain the effects of powerful creatures for a turn on a mana rock. Now, it won't let you replicate ETB effects on those creatures, but you can target your opponent's creatures with it if they have anything really powerful that you want to sort of steal for a turn. You could also target one of your pinger creatures that taps to do damage, and the Cursed Mirror will gain haste so you can use it right away. For example, you could tap your Heartless Hidetsugu to have everyone's life total, and then cast your Cursed Mirror and clone it and kill your original Heartless Hidetsugu due to the legend rule, and then tap the Cursed Mirror to drain everyone's life again. Just a really fun and surprisingly useful card. Now the last card I want to mention is Theater of Horrors. This is an enchantment that costs 1 red-black. At the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top card of your library. Then, during your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you can play cards and cast spells from among the cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. So this is just more card advantage, and with all of our group Slug effects, you won't have any problem accessing the cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. Now you can even pay 3 in a red to have Theater of Horrors deal 1 damage to target opponent or planeswalker. This is a very overcosted ability, but at least you'll have it if you need it. So that's most of the deck. As always, I didn't mention every card in the deck, but I tried to mention the most synergistic pieces that fit the deck's theme, but as always you can see the link to the full deck list in the description. And now let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Florian Voldaren Scion deck has an average mana value of 3.06. We have 28 cards that do damage to our opponents, or maybe all players, outside of combat damage. A few of these are single use like Flame Rift, but most of them are repeatable like Keen Duelist. There are 11 cards that gain us life, whether that's lifelink effects from things like Basilisk Collar, or draining effects like Sanctum of Stonefangs. Now this deck has 11 sources of ramp. I wanted a decent amount of ramp in this deck, because whatever we find with Florian's trigger, we need to play that card this turn, or we're going to lose access to it. Not to mention, we've possibly already paid mana this turn on something like Flame Rift to make our opponents lose life to trigger Florian in the first place, so you'll need to have access to a comfortable amount of mana in this deck. We have 7 sources of card draw, not counting the commander, and with our card advantage in the command zone, I don't think we really need more than that. I typically find that mana is a bigger limitation than card advantage in this deck. We have 11 or so pieces of single target removal. You might be able to count things like Pestilence Demon or Chandra's Incinerator as removal as well, though they're a bit more conditional. And we have 3 to 4 board wipes. Again, you could count cards like Pestilence Demon, you might count Vandal Blast, which can be a board wipe for artifacts. So depending on how you characterize them, we have 3 or 4 board wipes or so. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $87.85 on TCGplayer.com, so it's a very affordable budget deck. A lot of these pinger creatures like Spear Spewer and Lobber Crew are really specific for this deck and not widely played in other decks, so they're quite affordable. And some of them are commons as well. Alright, so that is Florian Voldaren Scion. Again, I was impressed by the value that Florian provides, and I want to stress, it's much better than just drawing an extra card each turn. This particular Florian build is a grindy deck that will slowly burn out all of your opponents while simultaneously using a few life gain effects to hopefully keep your head above water. Combining these draining effects with the card advantage of Florian makes this feel sort of like a Rakdos Yuriko deck, except you don't need to attack to get your value, which is pretty cool. Now I also like that Florian can be built in a lot of different ways, and you could just use Florian as a value engine. And that card filtering and pseudo draw in the command zone is pretty unique within the Rakdos color combination. But that's all I've got for today. As always, let me know in the comments if you liked this video, or if you didn't. And let me know if there's a particular commander or deck strategy that you'd like to see turned into a deck tech for Commander, especially an unconventional one. I don't currently have any more plans for Innistrad Midnight Hunt commanders, unless of course anyone's interested in some of them that I haven't covered yet, so I may move on to other content. at least until we start getting spoilers for Innistrad Crimson Vow, which will actually be pretty soon. But anyways, that is all for today. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.